April 5th, 1945, Freeman Army Airfield, Indiana. 101 American officers, trained pilots, bombardiers, navigators, are placed under arrest. Their crime? They walked through a door. The handcuffs click shut. The armed guards stand ready. And across the base, white officers watch in silence as their fellow servicemen, all of them black, all of them qualified to fly multi-engine bombers into combat, are led away like criminals. This isn't happening in enemy territory. This is happening on American soil, at an American military base, to American warriors preparing to fight fascism overseas. Why would the United States Army arrest 101 of its own officers in the middle of a world war? The answer would expose the most bitter hypocrisy at the heart of America's fight for freedom, and light a fuse that would burn all the way to the civil rights movement. The year is 1945. American forces are pushing toward Berlin. In the Pacific, Marines are island-hopping toward Japan. The greatest generation is fighting tyranny, racism, and oppression across two oceans. Back home, posters proclaim freedom and democracy. But for hundreds of thousands of black servicemen, that freedom stops at the color line. The 477th Bombardment Group, known simply as the 477, represents something unprecedented in American military aviation. These men are the first black bomber crews trained to fly the B-25 Mitchell, a twin-engine medium bomber that's proving itself in both theaters of war. Unlike the celebrated Tuskegee fighter pilots who've already earned their combat stripes over Europe, the 477 has been kept stateside, delayed, relocated, and systematically denied the resources to become combat-ready. Since their activation in January 1944 at Selfridge Field near Detroit, the 477 has been moved 4 times in just over a year. First Selfridge, then Godman Field in Kentucky, then briefly to Atterbury, and finally to Freeman Army Airfield in Seymour, Indiana. Each move disrupts training. Each relocation costs months of progress. White bomber groups go from formation to combat deployment in 5 to 9 months. The 477, after more than a year, they're still not declared combat ready. The reason isn't ability, it's something far more insidious. Freeman Field sits in rural Indiana, southwest of Seymour, a small town where fewer than 100 black residents live. When the 400 officers of the 477 arrive in March 1945, they find a base with modern facilities, adequate runways for B-25 operations, and a brand-new officers' club that they're forbidden to enter. The town of Seymour greets them with open hostility. Local businesses refuse service. Signs go up. The message is clear. You're not welcome here. On base, the situation is even worse. The commanding officer, Colonel Robert R. Selway, a West Point graduate and veteran commander, has a reputation. When he previously commanded units with black pilots, he drew a literal line down the middle of a base movie theater to enforce segregation. His superior, Major General Frank O. Hunter, commander of the 1st Air Force, has made his position equally clear. He's been quoted saying the country isn't ready to accept white officers and black officers at the same social level, basing his opinion on 125 years of American history. But there's a problem with Hunter's and Selway's plans. Army Regulation 210-10, established by the War Department, explicitly prohibits the racial segregation of officers at Army camps. Any public space open to officers on a base must be open to all officers. No exceptions, no exclusions based on race. Selway knows this. Hunter knows this. So they devise a scheme. Picture yourself as a young officer in the 477. Maybe you're a pilot who graduated from Tuskegee Army Airfield, where you mastered the complexities of formation flying and instrument navigation. Perhaps you're a bombardier, trained to calculate wind drift and target coordinates while enemy flak bursts around your aircraft. Or a navigator, responsible for guiding a 5-man crew across hundreds of miles of hostile territory and bringing them home. You've earned your silver wings. You wear the bars of a commissioned officer. Some of you are combat veterans who flew with the 332 fighter group over Italy and North Africa, men who've seen the Mediterranean from the cockpit, who've returned from missions with bullet holes in your wings. You transferred to the bomber program because the Army finally opened multi-engine training to black aviators, because you wanted to fly the bigger planes, to command larger crews, to prove that black officers could handle the most complex combat missions. You write letters home to mothers in Detroit, fathers in Los Angeles, wives in Chicago, sweethearts in Alabama. You tell them about the training, about learning the B-25 Mitchell, a beautiful machine with 2 Wright Cyclone engines, each producing 1,700 horsepower, a wingspan of 67 feet, and the firepower to take on enemy interceptors and ground targets. You tell them you're ready. You tell them you'll make them proud. What you don't tell them, what you can't quite put into words, is the grinding humiliation of serving a country that won't serve you back. One unnamed lieutenant from Detroit, a former labor organizer who understands how power works and how systems oppress, watches his fellow officers endure daily insults. Another officer from Los Angeles, a bombardier who roomed with a future baseball legend named Jackie Robinson at UCLA, feels the weight of wearing a uniform that promises equality but delivers contempt. A third officer, a navigator from New Jersey, sees the contradiction in every briefing. They're training to eliminate fascism abroad while living under American apartheid at home. These men aren't radicals. They're patriots. They volunteered to fight. They endured the grueling selection process. They survived the washout rate at flight school. They mastered aircraft that kill careless pilots. And now, stationed at Freeman Field in the spring of 1945, with the war in Europe reaching its climax, they face a choice that no American officer should ever have to make: obey an illegal order or challenge the system that created it. March 1st, 1945. The 477 arrives at Freeman Field by train. Officers disembark, eager to see the new facilities. The base is impressive: long runways, modern hangars, updated maintenance shops, and there, gleaming and new, 2 officers' clubs. Club number 1 is shabby, run down, lacking basic amenities. Club number 2 is pristine: comfortable furniture, better food, recreational facilities, everything an officer could want after a long day of training. Colonel Selway gathers the black officers for a briefing. The base has designated facilities, he explains. Club number 1 is for trainees. Club number 2 is for base and supervisory personnel, the instructors. It just so happens that every single trainee is black. It just so happens that every single instructor is white. The scheme is transparent. Recorded telephone conversations between Selway and General Hunter, conversations they don't know are being documented, reveal their true intentions. They repeatedly refer to Club number 2 as the White Club, making sure their official orders don't say anything about color, race, or creed. Hunter tells Selway he'd be delighted for them to commit enough actions that way so I can court-martial some of them. They're setting a trap. The black officers know it. Many of them are combat veterans who outrank some of the white instructors. They've logged more flying hours, survived more dangerous situations, proven their competence under fire. Now they're being classified as trainees and barred from facilities their rank and status entitle them to use. On April 7th, Selway formalizes the segregation with Base Regulation 85-2. It's a document that outlines which facilities each group can use: the tennis courts, the swimming pool, the officers' clubs. At the bottom of the regulation is a signature line and a statement. I certify that I have read and fully understand the above order. Every officer on base is ordered to read it and sign it. To sign is to acknowledge the regulation's authority. To sign is to accept segregation. To sign is to validate the very system they've been trained to fight against overseas. The black officers face an impossible dilemma. They can sign, accept the humiliation, swallow their pride, focus on training, and hope to deploy to combat where their valor might earn them respect. Or they can refuse, risk arrest, court-martial, dishonorable discharge, and the possibility of facing the death penalty under the 64th Article of War for insubordination during wartime. 400 black officers stare at that piece of paper. Most of them, reluctantly, put their names on the line. They object. They're furious. But they sign. 101 officers refuse. But before those 101 make their stand, another group decides to test the system directly. They're going to walk into club number 2. They're going to sit down. They're going to order a drink. And they're going to force the Army to show its hand. What will happen when they do? April 5th, 1945, evening at Freeman Field. The sun sets over the Indiana countryside, casting long shadows across the runways where B-25s sit in neat rows, their aluminum skins reflecting the dying light. In the barracks, a group of black officers prepares for an operation more dangerous than any combat mission they've trained for. They check their uniforms, every button fastened, every crease sharp, every insignia properly placed. They're not going into battle, but they're going to war. The officer who'll lead them, a second lieutenant from Detroit with experience as a labor organizer, understands what's at stake. This isn't just about a club, it's about dignity. It's about forcing America to confront its own hypocrisy. The plan is simple. Enter club number 2 in small groups. If turned away, leave peacefully. Let the next group try. Force the command structure to make arrests. Lots of arrests. Make it impossible to ignore. Make it a crisis. At approximately 7:30 in the evening, the first group of black officers approaches club number 2. Their shoes echo on the pavement. The building ahead is lit up, warm, inviting, and forbidden. Through the windows they can see white officers relaxing, laughing, drinking, men they train with, men they fly with, men who, on paper, are their equals. They reach the door. An officer steps forward to block them. Major Andrew M. White, the officer in charge of the club. He's polite but firm. The club is for base and supervisory personnel only. Trainees aren't permitted. The black officers ask for clarification. Are they not officers? Are their commissions somehow invalid? Major White repeats his instructions. They need to leave. The first group turns and walks away. No confrontation, no raised voices. They simply leave. 30 minutes later, a second group arrives. 19 officers this time, including the labor organizer from Detroit. They're met by First Lieutenant Joseph D. Rogers, the officer of the day, who's stationed at the door on Colonel Selway's direct orders. Rogers wears a holstered .45 caliber pistol. He delivers the same message. Trainees aren't permitted. The 19 officers look at each other. They've come this far. They've made their decision. As one, they step forward and enter the club. Inside, the room goes quiet. White officers freeze. Drinks halfway to their lips. The jukebox plays on, oblivious. The 19 black officers stand in the center of the room, their presence a thunderclap in the silence. Major White orders them to leave. They refuse. They're commissioned officers, they explain. This is an officers' club. Army Regulation 210-10 is clear. Major White places them under arrest. In quarters. It's a lesser form of arrest, essentially house arrest. The 19 officers acknowledge the order and leave, returning to their barracks. They've made their point. They've forced the command to act. But they're not done. Throughout the evening, more groups arrive. Some are turned away at the door, some push past. The situation grows tenser. Lieutenant Rogers, guarding the entrance, confronts a second lieutenant from Los Angeles, a bombardier with fire in his eyes. There's a moment, witnesses will later disagree about exactly what happened, where the bombardier brushes past Rogers, who claims he was shoved. The bombardier denies it. It doesn't matter. Rogers has him arrested on the spot. By the end of the night, 36 officers are under arrest. The next evening, April 6th, it happens again. 25 more officers attempt to enter Club Number 2, 25 more arrests. The total climbs to 61. Colonel Selway is furious. This is exactly what he wanted, an excuse to crack down. But the scale of it is beyond what he expected. 61 officers under arrest means 61 empty seats in briefing rooms, 61 missing pilots and bombardiers and navigators. The 477 is already behind schedule. Now it's hemorrhaging personnel. He decides to formalize everything with Base Regulation 85-2. Every officer must sign it. No exceptions. April 9th. The regulation is distributed. Most black officers, grinding their teeth, sign it. They've already seen what happens when you resist. They have families. They have careers. They can't all throw everything away. But 101 officers, including 42 who were arrested on April 5th and 6th, refused to sign. April 11th. The interviews begin. One by one, officers are called before a board. They're shown the regulation. They're given a direct order. Sign it. One by one, they refuse. One unnamed officer from East Chicago, Indiana, a former flying instructor at Tuskegee Institute who had to transfer from fighters to bombers because of his size, remembers Colonel Selway's announcement about the restricted facilities. The black officers booed him, he later recalled, loud and long. Now, sitting before the board, that same officer refuses to sign. He knows what it means. He's read the 64th Article of War. He knows the maximum penalty during wartime is execution. He refuses anyway. Across the base, the same scene repeats, 101 times. 101 officers, each with his own story, his own reasons, his own fears, each choosing to stand rather than kneel. April 13th. In the early morning darkness, 101 officers are roused from their quarters. They're assembled on the flight line. Armed guards surround them. Military police watch with rifles ready. The officers are loaded onto aircraft and flown northeast to Bombardment Field in Kentucky, where the 477 had been stationed before Freeman. At Godman, they're placed under house arrest, guarded by armed men and dogs. They're not told how long they'll be held. They're not told what charges they'll face. Some fear they'll face a firing squad. 3 officers are held back at Freeman Field, the bombardier from Los Angeles, and 2 others, accused of the jostling incident on April 5th of using physical force against Lieutenant Rogers. They face more serious charges. They face court-martial. But the story isn't over. The arrest of 101 officers creates an immediate crisis, not just at Freeman Field, but throughout the chain of command and across the country. Within days, the black press picks up the story. The Pittsburgh Courier, the Indianapolis Recorder, and papers across the nation run headlines about the Freeman Field Mutiny. The term isn't quite accurate. There was no violence, no refusal to follow lawful military orders related to training or operations, but it captures the drama, the defiance, the sense that something unprecedented has happened. The NAACP mobilizes. Thurgood Marshall, the organization's chief legal counsel and future Supreme Court justice, begins coordinating the defense. Marshall doesn't appear in person for the hearings, but he directs strategy from behind the scenes, understanding that this case could set precedent far beyond one bomber group at one Indiana airfield. Letters flood into the War Department. Civil rights organizations demand answers. Labor unions, remembering that several of the arrested officers have backgrounds in organized labor, apply pressure. Members of Congress start asking questions. Senator Arthur H. Vandenberg wants to know why American officers are being arrested for entering an officers' club during wartime. Inside the Army, confusion reigns. Major General Hunter wants to prosecute all 101 officers to the fullest extent. Colonel R.E. Kunkel, the Army Air Force's Chief of Justice, argues for releasing everyone, that the arrests were improper, that Base Regulation 85-2 clearly violates Army Regulation 210-10, that the Army has no legal ground to stand on. The War Department reviews the case. Analysts pore over the regulations. They examine the telephone transcripts between Selway and Hunter, the ones where both men explicitly discuss maintaining segregation while carefully avoiding racial language in written orders. The evidence is damning. Selway and Hunter deliberately circumvented Army policy. They knowingly violated standing regulations. They set a trap and then arrested officers for refusing to validate an illegal order. April 19th. General George C. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, the architect of America's victory in Europe, one of the most respected military leaders in the world, intervenes. He issues an order. Release the 101 officers immediately. April 23rd. At Bombardment Field, the news arrives. The 101 are told they're being released. There's relief, but also bitterness, because before they're freed, General Hunter inserts administrative reprimands into each officer's permanent military file. Not a court-martial, not an official punishment, but a black mark that will follow them for the rest of their careers, a permanent stain suggesting they were somehow at fault. The three officers held back at Freeman Field face a different fate. Their court-martial is scheduled for July. They're charged with disobeying orders and, in the Bombardiers case, with offering violence against a superior officer, the alleged jostling incident. The prosecution will seek the death penalty. Back at Freeman Field, Colonel Selway is quietly relieved of command in May. He faces no court-martial, no reprimand, no consequences for creating an illegal policy that violated Army regulations and sparked a national controversy. He'll retire with full honors and eventually be buried in Arlington National Cemetery. On June 21st, a new commander is appointed to lead the 477, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the first black graduate of West Point in the 20th century, the combat-tested leader of the 332 fighter group, a man who's already proven himself over the skies of Europe. Davis takes command on July 1st. For the first time, black officers replace white officers in all command and supervisory positions throughout the 477. The group is restructured, renamed the 477 Composite Group, and given a new mission: prepare for deployment to the Pacific Theater. Training accelerates. Morale improves. Finally, the 477 has a chance to prove itself in combat. But on August 14th, Japan surrenders. The war ends before the 477 ever deploys overseas. But what happened was far from over. July 2nd and 3rd, 1945. Bombardment Field, Kentucky. 3 officers stand court-martial. Second Lieutenants Marsden A. Thompson and Shirley R. Clinton are tried together. Second Lieutenant Roger C. Terry, the bombardier from Los Angeles, the UCLA graduate who roomed with Jackie Robinson, the man who allegedly jostled Lieutenant Rogers, is tried separately. The courtroom is tense from the moment proceedings begin. The court-martial board consists of 6 black officers, a small victory in itself, proof that the Army can't ignore what's happened. The NAACP sends a legal team led by Ted Barry, president of the organization's Cincinnati branch. And then something remarkable happens. Every single white officer called to testify refuses to salute the black officers on the board. Every single one. Each time, proceedings halt. The presiding officer has to remind the witness that saluting is military custom, that these are commissioned officers, that their race doesn't invalidate their rank. Each time the white officer reluctantly complies. And the message is clear. Even in defeat, even when regulations and law are on the side of the black officers, many white officers refuse to grant them basic respect. The testimonies reveal contradictions. Some white officers were allowed into Club No. 2 without question, regardless of their assignment or duty status. Some black officers with combat experience and higher rank than white instructors were turned away. The scheme becomes obvious. It was never about trainee versus instructor status. It was always about race. Colonel Selway's testimony is the most dramatic. He objects to nearly every question, claiming they're irrelevant and immaterial. The presiding officer has to repeatedly remind him that witnesses don't have the right to object to questions during their own testimony. Selway is officially labeled a hostile witness, an extraordinary rebuke during a court-martial. More damaging still, Selway's testimony contradicts his own recorded telephone conversations with General Hunter. Under oath, he claims the club designations were based purely on duty assignments, but the transcripts reveal him repeatedly referring to Club No. 2 as the White Club and discussing how to enforce segregation without explicitly mentioning race. The hypocrisy stands naked for everyone to see. The United States Army arrested 101 of its own officers for refusing to validate a policy that violated the Army's own regulations. The officers were right. Selway and Hunter were wrong. The entire chain of command knew it, and yet the charade had been allowed to continue until it exploded into a national crisis. The verdict arrives. Thompson and Clinton acquitted of all charges. The board finds no evidence they violated any lawful order. Terry's case is more complex. He's found not guilty of disobeying an order. The board agrees that Base Regulation 85-2 was invalid. But he's found guilty of jostling a superior officer. The prosecution had asked for the death penalty. The board sentences him to a fine of $150, paid in 3 monthly installments of $50 each, along with loss of rank and a dishonorable discharge. His fellow officers immediately take up a collection to pay the fine. Terry never pays it himself. His brothers-in-arms cover every cent. But the damage is done. Terry loses his command of a B-25 bomber. He's discharged from the military in November 1945, barely 2 years after enlisting. His dream of being a combat pilot is over. When he applies to law school after the war, when he seeks employment, when he fills out any form requiring disclosure of military service, he must check the box marked dishonorable discharge and identify himself as a felon. For Lieutenant Roger C. Terry, the Freeman Field Mutiny will cost him 50 years of his life, and yet the seeds have been planted. May 18, 1945, just days after Germany's surrender and weeks before the court-martial. A War Department committee reviews the entire Freeman Field incident. Their conclusion is swift and unambiguous. Base Regulation 85-2 violated Army Regulation 210-10. Colonel Selway's policy was illegal from the moment he issued it. The black officers were right to refuse to sign it. The committee doesn't say the words explicitly, but the implication is clear. The United States Army arrested 101 officers for refusing to endorse an illegal, discriminatory policy that contradicted the military's own rules. The officers who should have faced court-martial were Selway and Hunter, but they never do. Instead, the 477 is restructured. Under Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr.'s leadership, it becomes the 477 Composite Group, combining bomber and fighter elements. Black officers finally command their own squadrons. The barriers that prevented their advancement begin to crumble, not because of a change of heart within the military establishment, but because 101 officers refused to back down. The war ends before the 477 deploys. In 1946, the unit is reassigned to Lockbourne Field in Ohio, now Rickenbacker International Airport. The base becomes a showcase for black military aviation, a place where black officers command, where integration is the norm rather than the exception, where the model for a desegregated Air Force begins to take shape. In 1947, the 477 is deactivated. Its mission is complete, not in combat against a foreign enemy, but in the fight against institutional racism at home. July 26, 1948. President Harry S. Truman signs Executive Order 9981, mandating the integration of all United States armed services. The order doesn't mention Freeman Field. It doesn't cite the 101 officers by name, but historians of the civil rights movement recognize the connection. The Freeman Field Mutiny demonstrated that segregation in the military was unsustainable, that black servicemen would no longer accept second-class status, that the contradiction between America's stated ideals and its treatment of its own soldiers had become impossible to ignore. The Air Force, which becomes an independent service in 1947, begins desegregating before Truman's order takes effect. The lessons of Freeman Field inform that process. Integration isn't just a moral imperative, it's operationally necessary. Segregated units waste talent, duplicate resources, and undermine morale. The most efficient, effective Air Force is one that promotes based on merit, not skin color. The ripple effects extend beyond the military. The Freeman Field Mutiny becomes a model for civil disobedience, a template for challenging unjust laws through nonviolent resistance. The tactic the black officers used, walking into a segregated space in small groups, forcing authorities to make mass arrests, generating public pressure through media coverage, will be echoed in lunch counter sit-ins, freedom rides, and Birmingham demonstrations. Coleman Young, the labor organizer turned second lieutenant who helped coordinate the April 5th walk-in, will later become Detroit's first black mayor, bringing lessons from Freeman Field into urban politics and civil rights organizing. And yet, for decades, the 101 officers live with the stigma. General Hunter's letters of reprimand remain in their files. Lieutenant Terry's dishonorable discharge follows him through law school, through his career as a probation investigator, through applications and interviews and background checks. Some of the 101 wear their reprimands as badges of honor, proof they stood against injustice. Others simply want them removed, want their records to reflect the truth. They were right, and the Army was wrong. August 12, 1995, Atlanta, Georgia. The Tuskegee Airmen hold their annual convention. Among the attendees are survivors of the Freeman Field Mutiny, now in their 70s and 80s, men who've spent half a century knowing they were right but feeling the stain of those reprimand letters in their permanent files. Rodney A. Coleman, Assistant Secretary of the Air Force, takes the podium. He announces that the Air Force is officially removing General Hunter's letters of reprimand from the permanent military records of 15 of the officers involved in the Freeman Field protests. The remaining 89 letters will be removed when requests are filed. The 104 officers involved in the so-called mutiny, Coleman says, have lived the last 50 years knowing they were right in what they did, yet feeling the stigma of an unfair stain on their records because they were American fighting men, too, and wanted to be treated as such. The room erupts in applause. Some of the old airmen weep. And then Coleman makes another announcement. The Air Force is setting aside Lieutenant Roger C. Terry's court-martial conviction. After 50 years, Terry, now 74 years old, still living in Los Angeles, receives a full pardon. His rank is restored, his fine is refunded. The dishonorable discharge is expunged. For the first time since November 1945, Roger Terry is officially an honorably discharged officer of the United States Air Force. Terry travels back to Freeman Field in August 1997. He stands on the tarmac where B-25s once sat in rows, where he trained to fly combat missions he never got to complete. Seymour Mayor John Burkhart honors him and his fellow mutineers. The Indiana Historical Bureau places a marker commemorating the Freeman Field Mutiny. The story is finally being told correctly. 2007, President George W. Bush presents the Congressional Gold Medal to the Tuskegee Airmen, including the survivors of Freeman Field. It's the highest civilian honor Congress can bestow. The citation recognizes their combat achievements and their fight against systemic racial injustice. 2009. Lieutenant Roger C. Terry passes away in Los Angeles at age 87. Obituaries remember him not as a convicted mutineer, but as a civil rights pioneer, a man who risked everything to challenge an unjust system, a patriot who loved his country enough to demand it live up to its ideals. Today, Freeman Field is gone. Deactivated in 1948, parts of it converted to municipal use, parts sold for agriculture. But the legacy endures. The 477 was reactivated in 2007 as the 477 Fighter Group, the first Air Force Reserve Command unit to fly the F-22 Raptor, a technological marvel that wouldn't exist without the integrated Air Force the Freeman Field mutineers helped create. And the lesson? The lesson echoes across decades. 101 officers stood in the spring of 1945 and said, "No more. We will not sign your illegal order. We will not endorse your discrimination. We are American officers, and we demand to be treated as such." They risked execution. They accepted arrest. They endured imprisonment and court-martial and dishonorable discharge. They sacrificed their careers, their reputations, their futures, and they won, not immediately, not cleanly. 50 years passed before the Air Force officially acknowledged they were right, but they won because they understood something fundamental. The fight for freedom doesn't end at an enemy's border. Sometimes the hardest battles are fought at home, in the quiet confrontation between what America claims to be and what America actually is. The Freeman Field Mutiny exposed the biggest hypocrisy at the heart of World War II, that the nation fighting for liberty abroad denied it at home, that the military defending democracy worldwide enforced apartheid within its own ranks, that the very officers trained to eliminate fascism were treated as less than human by their own command structure. 101 officers forced America to look in the mirror. What they saw wasn't pretty, but it was necessary, and from that painful reflection came change, slow, incomplete, still ongoing, but real. The integrated military of today exists because those officers refuse to accept anything less. Their story isn't just history, it's a reminder. That courage isn't only found in combat. That patriotism sometimes means challenging your country to be better. That the uniform you wear doesn't protect you from injustice, but it can give you a platform to confront it. The Freeman Field Mutiny proved that ordinary officers, armed with nothing but conviction and the courage to stand together, can change an institution, and through it, help change a nation. If stories like this one, about the unsung heroes who fought for freedom on the front lines and at home, resonate with you, hit that like button and subscribe. There are dozens more tales from the Second World War waiting to be told, stories of courage, sacrifice, and the ongoing struggle to make America's ideals match its actions. Don't miss them.